everybody, Yankee here. If you remember recently, I compared my new PSA dagger to an actual Glock, and the dagger, the PSA, actually came out pretty good in that competition. I actually preferred the dagger a little bit. If you didn't see that video, I'll link it in the upper corner here. Now, when I got that dagger, I also got a 5.7 Rock from PSA. So some people have asked me, would I compare this PSA 5.7 Rock to another 5.7 by 28 gun? So today I'm going to compare it to my FN Fiveseven because that's the only other 5.7 by 28 that I actually own. The PSA would actually be a closer comparison to like the Smith & Wesson M&P 5.7 or the Ruger 5.7, but I don't own those, so we're going to compare it to the FN. And there's only one reason why the PSA is actually more comparable to those other two guns than it is the FN. And actually, it's not really comparable to any of those guns. But like I said, the one I have is the FN Fiveseven, so we're going to compare the two of those. Now, where these guns are similar is the physical size of the guns and the caliber they're chambered in. And that is pretty much it. That's the only real similarities. Everything else is pretty different on these guns. The way these guns operate, their barrels are very different. And I don't just mean this one is threaded and this one isn't. The PSA uses a lock breech system, whereas the FN uses a delayed blowback system. Also, the PSA's slide is a regular steel slide, more like a Glock or a Smith & Wesson or a Ruger, which is why I said it's more comparable to them. It's that reason there alone it has just a regular metal slide, whereas the FN has an internal one-piece slide that is covered with a polymer cover. So it gives it kind of a different look, kind of a different feel. The Smith & Wesson and the Ruger also just use a metal slide, so that's why I think they're a little more similar to the PSA than the FN is. Now, both these guns do have suppressor height sights, but the sights on the PSA are not as good. They're basically Glock sights, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they're not as adjustable as the FN sights because the rear sight on the FN is fully adjustable, both in windage and elevation. It's just a little bit nicer of a sight. And even though both guns are cut for a red dot, I only have a red dot on the FN because I won't be keeping the PSA. Another difference between the two guns here is the PSA has an external extractor, whereas the extractor on the FN is, of course, inside the polymer cover. You don't see it. Now, both of these triggers are single action, and both of them are pretty light. The FN is averaging about 3 pounds. The PSA's coming in under 5 pounds, just over 4.5 pounds. The PSA has a Glock-like trigger with the little dongle on it there, whereas the FN does not have that. And no, this is not another Sig Sauer situation because the FN does have a manual safety. Now, these guns have a very similar feel in the hand, actually. The grip on the FN feels a little bigger, but both of them are very comfortable, and both of them are similar capacity, with the PSA having the slight edge because it holds 23 rounds in the magazine plus 1 in the chamber, whereas the FN only holds 20 in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. So you do get 2 extra rounds with the PSA. Now that we've looked at the outsides of the guns and the obvious features, let's take a look inside and see which one looks a little nicer. This is where I think the PSA really shone when I compared it to the Glock. I think it was nicer, had a nicer frame quality. The slide was finished just a little bit better. I just liked it better. But when you compare the frame from the FN to the frame from the PSA, it's actually reversed. I think the FN frame's a little beefier, a little better made, whereas the PSA one is a little more Glock-like. So even though it did really good compared to the Glock, I don't think it's as good as the FN. I think the FN puts a little more effort, a little more material into their frame. And I do think they do the finishing just a tiny bit better. And speaking of finishing, if you look at the insides of the slides, well, they're a little different. The FN is a little more complicated, but it's very well made. It's a very precise piece of machinery. It's almost like a sewing machine, whereas the PSA is very Glock-like. And I use that to mean it's fairly simple. Now, it's pretty well put together. It's well finished. You don't see a lot of machining marks or anything like that, but it is a more simple mechanism. And that actually brings us to the biggest difference between the two. The FN Fiveseven, like the Smith & Wesson and the Ruger, is an internal hammer-fired gun. there's actually a hammer in there that is actuated by that single action trigger. Whereas the PSA, once again, is like a Glock. It is just a striker-fired gun. And it's a single-action striker-fired gun. It doesn't even do all the things like a Glock trigger. It's less complicated even than the Glock trigger. When you look at the back of the guns here, you can see where the PSA has the hole for the striker, and the FN does not have one, since it does have, like I said, the internal hammer. And you can feel that when you shoot both guns. The FN does have a nicer feel on the trigger. The mechanism is better, and I do like the way it uses that internal hammer a lot better than using a striker like the PSA. And that's the really big difference. I think that this gun, the PSA, is a good gun. You know, it's by no means great. It's pretty much on the same level as a Glock. That's why when I reviewed this gun, I did a standalone video of this gun, and I'll put that in the upper corner too if you missed that. It functioned fine, and it was a decent gun. It just wasn't anything that was amazing. And like I said, it's very Glock-like. So I said, if you were looking for a Glock chambered in 5.7x28, the PSA is probably the gun for you. But if you want the gun that's just a better gun, then that's going to be the FN. It's a little better made, it's got a better mechanism, it's got a better trigger, it just works better, and like I said, love the hammer a lot better than a striker. It's just an overall higher quality, better gun. That's in no way saying the PSA is bad, it's just a different type of gun. And like I said, not quite as high a quality, but guess what? It's like half the price. In fact, it might be a little less than half the price. Plus, you can choose different options with the PSA. You can decide what color barrel you want. I went with bronze. You can decide what color slide and frame you want. I went with sniper green. You're pretty much stuck with whatever FN puts together for you because you don't build it yourself. Whereas you build the PSA yourself, you can buy every single part, put it together. So if you're someone like that, you like to build your own things, or maybe you just like Glocks better, this PSA 5.7 Rock is actually a very good gun. And when you consider how much it costs, it's an excellent gun. Now the FN Fiveseven is just a great gun regardless of the price. This is a gun you're never going to be sad you bought, never be, unhappy about owning. It's just one of the best guns you can have if you want to have fun. That being said, are either of these guns optimal carry guns? No, in some ways I think they're actually kind of novelties and kind of useless. At least that's what I used to think. But lately I've been doing a lot more practice with these guns. I actually went out and shot like 250 rounds through them. And I'm going to shoot another 200 rounds tomorrow through the FN Fiveseven because I enjoyed shooting it so much. And I've been testing the 5.7 round. I intentionally wanted to prove that it's useless. But so far, every time I test it, it proves me wrong. It does everything that 9mm does, maybe even a little better. So far, I haven't really been able to set a criteria of how different they are because they both have been doing everything I want them to do, everything I try to do very well. So I can't say either one is better than the other. And I really thought by now I'd be able to say, look, the 5.7 doesn't perform well at all. Unfortunately, it is. So I'm having to revamp my opinions. But that aside, like I said, one, the PSA is more Glock-like and it's for people who like to put together their own gun. And the other, the FN, is just for the person who likes to have the better gun.